I'm Liam, 34 male. I'm a lawyer navigating the legal maze of a city that never sleeps. My world is one of contracts, depositions, and the constant, calculated pressure of high-stakes civil litigation. But the most significant case I ever took on had nothing to do with my firm. It involved the woman I loved and the locked doors of her past. This is the story of how I helped my fiancée, Sophie, confront the monster she'd spent a lifetime running from, and how we fought for the justice she was denied. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My life on the surface was a portrait of success. I had a corner office with a view of the skyline, a career that demanded intellect and precision, and a reputation for being the calmest man in any room. But my greatest achievement wasn't a courtroom victory. It was Sophie Collins, my 26-year-old fiancée. She was an architect, a woman who didn't just design buildings but crafted spaces that felt alive. She was the one who taught me, a man buried in legal jargon, that happiness wasn't a clause in a contract but a quiet moment shared over a cup of tea. We met 3 years ago when my firm hired her to redesign our offices. I was expecting someone rigid and corporate, but Sophie walked in with a gentle energy that immediately disarmed me. Her brown hair was tied back in a messy but elegant bun, and she carried a sketchbook filled with intricate drawings. She didn't talk about floor plans, she spoke about flow, light, and emotion. "What do you want this space to feel like, Mr. Anderson?" She'd asked, her eyes lit with a genuine passion that I found utterly captivating. A man used to facts and figures, was stumped. Professional, I managed, but not sterile. She smiled, made a quick note, and then launched into a beautiful description of how natural wood, warm lighting, and open layouts could foster collaboration and peace. I was hooked. Our professional meetings soon blurred into personal conversations. I found myself looking forward to her visits, not just to see the office transform into a warm, inviting space, but to hear her voice and feel the calm she exuded. One afternoon, I gathered my courage and asked her out for coffee, clumsily framing it as a thank you for her work. She agreed with a smile that made my chest tighten. That coffee turned into dinners, weekend trips, and eventually, a shared life in a cozy Brooklyn apartment. Sophie was my anchor. Her gentle nature could soothe the stress of my most grueling days, and in turn, she found a sense of stability in me that allowed her to dream freely. After 2 years, I proposed on a quiet evening in our apartment. There were no grand gestures, just me on one knee with a simple ring I'd spent weeks choosing. I asked her if she would build a life with me. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, but then she asked something that struck me as odd. "Are you sure, Liam?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you sure you want me?" I laughed it off, assuring her that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. She transformed our apartment into a home, every detail infused with her love and impeccable taste. Coming home to the scent of her cooking and the sight of her smile was the best part of my day. It was a simple, complete happiness. But amidst this idyllic life, I began to notice tiny cracks in the facade. Whenever the conversation drifted toward her family or her childhood, Sophie would become evasive. "They live far away," she'd say vaguely, or "my mother isn't well." I didn't want to pry, respecting her privacy, but a lawyer's instinct for missing information is hard to suppress. The look in her eyes during these moments was unsettling, a flicker of fear, like someone guarding a secret too heavy to carry. The first time it truly registered was during a documentary about family reunions. I asked casually, "Should we invite your parents to visit before the wedding? They should see our home." The change in her was immediate. Her body went rigid and her hand clenched the sofa cushion. "Maybe later," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She quickly excused herself, leaving me with a profound sense of unease. After that, I couldn't help but notice the pattern. She had no childhood anecdotes, no stories of holiday gatherings or family trips like the ones I often shared. She had built a wall around her past, and any attempt to get close was met with a gentle but firm redirection. "The past is the past, my love," she would say with a soft smile. "All that matters is us right now." I wanted to accept that, to believe she was simply a private person. But the part of me trained to look for inconsistencies, for the story behind the story, couldn't let it go. There was a locked room in Sophie's heart, and I was beginning to fear. What lay behind it? Her strange habits began to take on a more ominous meaning. Every night, without fail, she would perform a ritualistic security check. She'd double-lock the front door, then walk through the apartment to ensure every window was latched shut. I initially found it endearing, a sign of her cautious nature. "Just being thorough," she'd say with a little shrug if she caught me watching. But then came the nights I'd wake to an empty space beside me. The first time, a jolt of panic shot through me. I found her in the living room, curled into a tight ball in the corner of the sofa, her arms wrapped around her knees as if to hold herself together. She was staring into the darkness, her expression completely vacant. "Sophie," I called softly. She jumped, and in the split second before she recognized me, I saw pure, unadulterated terror in her eyes. It was a look I'd seen on witnesses who had endured unspeakable things. "I'm okay," she said quickly, her voice thin. "Just couldn't sleep." She let me lead her back to bed, but as I held her, I could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. I knew she was lying. She was not okay. She was haunted. The life Sophie and I had built felt like a beautiful, handcrafted home, but I was becoming increasingly aware of a foundational crack, a hidden weakness that threatened to bring the whole structure down. The betrayal I felt wasn't from her. It was the chilling realization that her past had betrayed her in a way I couldn't yet comprehend, leaving behind scars that were both invisible and frighteningly real. My love for her was absolute, but it was being tested by a mystery I felt powerless to solve. The incident at my colleague's dinner party was a turning point. Sophie, as always, was radiant. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and she moved through the room with an easy grace, charming everyone she spoke to. I watched her from across the room, filled with a familiar sense of pride. But then another lawyer, Mark, a friendly but boisterous man, approached her to introduce himself. He extended his hand for a polite shake, and I saw Sophie's entire body tense up. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of panic that was there and gone in an instant, but I saw it. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward and her smile faltered. "Oh, sorry," she stammered, forcing a laugh. "I'm a bit clumsy tonight." Mark didn't seem to notice, but I did. I saw her hand tremble as she reached for her wine glass, her knuckles white. For the rest of the evening, her eyes kept darting toward the exits as if she was constantly plotting an escape route. On the car ride home, the silence felt heavy. I decided to gently probe. "Everything all right back there? You seemed a little on edge when Mark came over." She stared out the window, the passing streetlights casting fleeting shadows across her face. "It was just crowded," she said, her tone flat and dismissive. "I was getting tired, that's all." I didn't push. Pushing Sophie when she was like this was like pushing against a locked door. It only made it more secure. But a question had taken root in my mind and was now growing into a thick, thorny vine. What or who was she so afraid of? The evidence continued to mount in the quiet sanctuary of our own home. Her nightly ritual of checking the locks and windows became less endearing and more concerning. It wasn't the action itself, but the look on her face as she did it, a grim, focused expression, as if she wasn't just locking out intruders but holding back an encroaching darkness. The sleepless nights became more frequent. I would find her in the living room, sometimes just sitting, sometimes pacing, always with that same haunted look in her eyes. She would always offer a simple excuse, a stressful day at work, too much coffee, but the excuses were wearing thin. The fear I'd seen in her eyes that first time was a constant presence, lurking just beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. Then one afternoon, I noticed the scars. We were sitting on the couch, her arm resting on mine, and the light from the window caught a faint, silvery line on her wrist. It was thin and old, almost invisible. I gently traced it with my finger. "What's this from?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She snatched her arm back as if my touch had burned her. "Oh, that," she said quickly, her voice unnaturally bright. "Just a silly accident when I was a kid, it's nothing." She immediately changed the subject, asking me about a case I was working on. The speed of her deflection was a blaring alarm. It wasn't nothing. It felt like I had stumbled upon a piece of forbidden history. The disconnect between the woman I loved and the secrets she kept was becoming a chasm. I grew up in a loud, messy, imperfect family, but we had shared memories. We had stories of my dad's terrible attempts at grilling, of my mom's unwavering support at my baseball games. Sophie had a void where those memories should have been. When I gently suggested we plan a trip to meet her parents before the wedding, she became a master of evasion. "Work is just so crazy right now, honey," she'd say, "or let's get through this next project first." When I tried to pin her down on a date, she went completely still for a moment before promising to look into it. She never brought it up again. All the pieces were there, scattered on the table of my mind. The flinching at a simple handshake, the obsessive need for security, the sleepless nights spent staring into the void, the old scars she refused to explain, and the impenetrable wall around her past. As a lawyer, my job was to assemble disparate facts into a coherent narrative, to find the truth hidden in a mess of conflicting stories. Now I was faced with the most important case of my life, and the person I needed to understand was the woman I was going to marry. I could no longer stand by and pretend not to see the shadows that followed her. I needed to know what happened to her, not to satisfy some morbid curiosity, but because I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that whatever darkness she was running from was slowly catching up. I had to find a way to help her, even if it meant stepping into that darkness myself. The decision to investigate Sophie's past was one of the most difficult I've ever made. It felt like a profound violation of her trust, a betrayal of the safe space we had created together. Yet the alternative, watching the woman I loved slowly suffocate under the weight of an invisible burden, was unbearable. My legal training had taught me that sometimes you have to dig for the truth, not to place blame, but to understand the full scope of the damage. I resolved to be careful, to move with the discretion of a man handling a fragile piece of evidence, because that's what this was. Sophie's life, her pain, and I couldn't risk shattering it. My first clue came from an offhand comment she'd made months earlier. We were watching a film set in a quaint New England town, and she had remarked almost to herself, "That looks just like my old high school in Providence." Just one sentence, casually dropped, but it was the first concrete detail she had ever given me about her past. Providence, Rhode Island. It was a 4-hour drive from New York. I filed the name away, careful not to react, knowing that any sign of interest would cause her to retreat. That single piece of information became my starting point. I waited for an opportunity, a time when my actions wouldn't feel like a clandestine operation in our own home. It came one Tuesday when Sophie had an all-day site visit with a client. The apartment felt unnervingly quiet without her. My heart pounded with a mixture of guilt and determination as I began my search. I wasn't looking for signs of infidelity or anything of that nature. I was looking for a ghost. I started with a small wooden box she kept tucked away under our bed. She had once told me it contained old keepsakes, and I had never thought to look inside. Now it felt like a locked file cabinet in a cold case. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among a few faded photographs and a tarnished silver bracelet, was a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were yellowed with age, the edges soft and worn. It felt sacred, forbidden. For a moment, I considered closing the box and forgetting the whole thing. But the image of Sophie's terrified eyes in the middle of the night pushed me forward. I opened the notebook. The handwriting inside was hers, but it was the script of a much younger, much more frightened person. The letters were shaky, scrawled across the lined pages as if the hand that wrote them could barely hold the pen steady. It wasn't a diary of teenage crushes or school drama. It was a record of terror. The first line I read sent a shockwave through my system. "He came to my room again last night," it read. I heard his footsteps in the hall. I pretended to be asleep, but I could feel him standing in the doorway, watching me. I was too scared to even breathe. I felt the air leave my lungs. I read on, my horror growing with every page. The entries were sporadic, undated, but they painted a nightmarish picture. They spoke of hiding in closets, of stifling sobs into a pillow, of praying for the morning to come. One page contained a chilling, childish drawing that made my blood run cold. It depicted a large, shadowy figure with no face, just glowing red eyes and a mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. A monster from a fairy tale, but this one was real. Beneath the drawing, a single sentence was written in a desperate scrawl. "I want to run away, but there is nowhere to go." I slammed the notebook shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be Sophie. Not my Sophie, the woman who filled our home with laughter and light. But it was. The scars, the flinching, the nightly security checks, the sleepless vigils. In the dark, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The betrayal wasn't hers, it was the world's. The world had let this happen to her. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, the quiet apartment suddenly feeling like a tomb. The love of my life, the strongest person I knew, had endured a living hell, and she had carried it entirely alone. The lawyer in me took over, overriding the wave of nausea and rage that threatened to consume me. This notebook was a testimony. It was the voice of a victim who had been silenced, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed names, dates, and corroborating evidence. The shadowy figure in the drawing needed a face. I carefully placed the notebook back in the box, feeling as though I had disturbed a grave. My guilt was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a burning, protective fury. I wasn't just a concerned fiancé anymore. I was an advocate, and my client was the terrified young girl who wrote in that diary. I would not let her down. I had a name for a town and a story filled with holes. It was time to find the truth, no matter how ugly it was. My next steps had to be taken outside the walls of our home. I told Sophie I had to take a short business trip for a case in Rhode Island. It was a thin lie, and the flicker of anxiety in her eyes when I mentioned the state told me she was more perceptive than I gave her credit for, but she didn't question it. The 4-hour drive to Providence was the longest of my life. The open road felt like a descent, each mile taking me deeper into the darkness that Sophie had so desperately tried to escape. My heart was a block of ice in my chest. I wasn't just investigating a past trauma, I was walking into the crime scene of a stolen childhood. My first stop was the high school she had mentioned. It was an old brick building, exactly as I'd imagined, surrounded by leafy, quiet streets that belied the turmoil one of its students had endured. Through the school's alumni network, I found the name of her former art teacher, a woman named Miss Rosalie, who was now retired but still lived in the area. I met her at a small coffee shop. She was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, which faded the moment I mentioned Sophie's name. "Sophie Collins," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I remember her so vividly. She was a remarkable artist, so much talent but so fragile." I explained that I was Sophie's fiancé and that I was trying to understand some things from her past. Miss Rosalie's expression filled with a deep, ancient guilt. "That child was always so frightened," she said, her gaze distant. "Some days she'd come to class with bruises on her arms, sometimes even her neck. She'd wear long sleeves in the middle of May. I asked her about it, of course, but she would always say she'd fallen or run into a door. I didn't believe her for a second, but back then. We weren't equipped, we didn't know what to do. I reported it once anonymously, but nothing ever came of it. I've carried that guilt with me for years." Her words were like daggers. Someone had seen, someone had suspected, but the system had failed. I left the coffee shop with a signed, sworn statement from Miss Rosalie. My next stop was the local hospital. Using my credentials as a lawyer, I was able to petition for access to archived medical records. It took hours of navigating bureaucracy, but I finally found what I was looking for, a file under the name Sophie Collins. It was a log of horror disguised in clinical, detached language. Multiple emergency room visits between the ages of 12 and 16. A broken arm listed as a fall down the stairs. Minor burns attributed to a cooking accident. Deep cuts explained away as a slip with a crafting knife. The frequency was damning. No child is that clumsy. Each entry was a silent scream, documented and ignored. I returned to New York with a file that was growing heavier with every new piece of paper. The diary, the teacher's testimony, the hospital records, they all pointed to a single monstrous truth. Sophie's childhood wasn't just unhappy, it was a sustained campaign of terror, and the perpetrators were almost certainly the people who should have been protecting her, her family. The weight of it all was crushing. I sat in my car for an hour after I got back, parked a block away from our apartment, unable to face her. How could I look at her knowing what I knew? How could I pretend that everything was fine when I was holding the evidence of her nightmare in my briefcase? But I knew I couldn't stop. The notebook had mentioned a monster, but it hadn't given him a name. That was the piece I was still missing. I hired a private investigator, a former cop named Marcus who owed me a favor. He was discreet and efficient. "I need everything you can find on the family of Sophie Collins from Providence, Rhode Island," I told him over a burner phone. "Specifically, any male figures in the household do. Ring her teenage years, police reports, public records, anything." Marcus didn't ask why. "You'll have it in a week," he said. The file he sent back was thin, but it contained the key. Sophie's mother, Eleanor, had remarried when Sophie was 9. Her new husband was a man named Richard Vance. A quick background check revealed 2 prior sealed complaints of harassment from a former job, both dismissed due to lack of evidence. But then Marcus found something else, a name connected to one of those complaints, Lisa Reynolds. It took him another few days, but he found her. She was married, had 2 kids, and lived in a small town just outside of Providence. Approaching her was a massive risk. She had every right to slam the door in my face, but I had to try. I drove back to Rhode Island and found her house. When Lisa opened the door, I saw the same guarded weariness in her eyes that I sometimes saw in Sophie's. I introduced myself gently, explaining that I was a lawyer representing another one of Richard Vance's victims. Her face went pale. She tried to shut me down, saying she had a family now and couldn't get involved. "I understand," I said, my voice steady, "but he's still out there. The woman I represent, she endured it for years. Your voice could be the one thing that ensures he never hurts anyone again." I saw a flicker of conflict in her eyes. After a long, tense silence, she let me in. In her quiet living room, surrounded by photos of her smiling children, Lisa told me her story. Richard had been her manager at a retail store when she was 19. He had harassed her, cornered her, and threatened her job if she didn't comply with his advances. She had filed a report, but he had twisted the story, claiming she was a disgruntled employee. She was scared and alone, and she eventually dropped the case. It was a different kind of abuse from what Sophie had suffered, but it was from the same playbook of power and intimidation. I asked if she would be willing to give a recorded statement. She hesitated, then agreed. Her testimony detailing Richard's manipulative and predatory behavior was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. I now had a name for the monster, and I had a case. Returning to New York, the file I carried felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It was a meticulously organized testament to years of hidden pain. I had Sophie's diary, her medical records, sworn statements from her teacher and a former neighbor, and a damning recorded testimony from another one of Richard Vance's victims. As a lawyer, I knew I had a powerful case. As a man in love, I knew I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of our lives. There was no turning back now. The silence had to be broken. I chose a Saturday evening to talk to her. I wanted the setting to be as calm and safe as possible, a stark contrast to the storm I was about to unleash. I cooked her favorite pasta, opened a bottle of wine, and put on some soft music. She came out of the bedroom wearing a comfortable sweater, a small, tired smile on her face. "What's all this for?" she asked, her voice light. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Just wanted to have a nice night with you," I replied, my own voice tight with forced calm. We ate in near silence, the unspoken tension hanging between us. After dinner, we moved to the sofa. She rested her head on my shoulder and I wrapped my arm around her. This was it. I took a deep, steadying breath. "Sophie," I began, my voice low and serious. "We need to talk about something important." She sat up, her eyes immediately filled with a familiar wariness. "What is it, Liam?" I reached for her hand, holding it firmly in mine. "I know you've been carrying a heavy burden," I said, choosing my words with the care of a closing argument. "I didn't want to push you, but I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer. I found your diary, Sophie, and I went to Providence. I spoke to Miss Rosalie and I found the hospital records." Her face drained of all color. Her eyes widened in a look of pure, cornered panic, and her hands started to tremble in mine. I saw her walls go up, the defensive shield she had perfected over a lifetime. "I love you," I continued, my voice softening, "and I cannot let you do this alone anymore. Please just tell me what happened." For a moment, I thought she would bolt. She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand, Liam. I didn't want you to know. I was so scared you would leave if you knew." Her body started to shake with silent, suppressed sobs. The sight of her so broken shattered my heart. I resisted the urge to pull her into a hug, knowing she needed space to feel safe. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice resolute. "Nothing you can say will ever change how I feel about you, but I see the fear you live with every day. I see it in the middle of the night. Let me help you fight it." Our silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then a single sob escaped her, then another, until the dam of her composure finally broke. She collapsed into gut-wrenching, painful sobs that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of her soul. This was not just crying, this was grief, years of it pouring out of her. I pulled her into my arms and just held her, letting her cry against my chest, whispering that it was okay, that she was safe. When the storm of tears finally subsided, she began to speak. Her voice was a raw, trembling whisper, but each word was a piece of the truth she had locked away. "I grew up in that house with my mother, Alina," she started, "and my stepfather, Richard Vance, he was a monster." She choked on the word. "It started when I was 9. At first, it was just hitting, but then it got worse. He would come into my room at night. He did things to me, Liam, unspeakable things." The tears flowed again, soaking my shirt, but I remained perfectly still, afraid any movement would silence her. "And my mother," she continued, her voice laced with a pain that was almost worse than the fear. "She knew, she had to have known, but she did nothing. She told me to be quiet. She said if I told anyone, I would be the one to destroy the family, that it would be my fault." I felt a white-hot rage build inside me, so intense it was hard to breathe. The man was a predator, but the mother's betrayal was a unique kind of evil. As she unburdened herself of the horrific details, a new piece of the story emerged, one that explained the depth of her guilt. "There's something else," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have a younger brother, Noah. He's my mother's son with Richard. When I was 16, he walked in by accident. He saw what Richard was doing to me." My blood ran cold. From that day on, Richard started hurting him too. He beat him, threatened him, told him if he ever spoke a word, he would kill us both. When I finally ran away after I turned 18, I left him there, Liam. I left my little brother behind. This was the source of her deepest shame. It wasn't just what had been done to her, it was her perceived failure to protect Noah. "Is he still there?" I asked, my voice tight. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's 18 now, but he's still trapped. I get a text from him every few months just to let me know he's alive. I can't leave him there, Liam. If we do this, if we go after Richard, I have to get him out." In that moment, the entire scope of our mission came into focus. This was no longer just about getting justice for Sophie's past. It was a rescue operation. Noah wasn't just a forgotten detail, he was a living witness, a key to the entire case. But more than that, he was family. "Okay," I said, my voice firm with newfound purpose. "Then that's our plan. We're going to go get your brother, and then we're going to make them pay for everything." Our plan was twofold. First, we had to get to Noah and convince him he would be safe with us. Second, we would unleash the full force of the law on Richard and Alina. The first step was the most delicate. We drove to Providence on a gray, overcast weekend that mirrored our mood. Sophie was a bundle of nerves beside me, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't seen her brother in person in years, and she was terrified of what we might find. We had arranged to meet Noah near his high school, a neutral ground away from the House of Horrors. When we arrived, I saw a young man leaning against a fence, his shoulders slumped. He was thin with the same brown hair as Sophie, but his eyes were filled with a haunted, hunted look. Noah, Sophie called out, her voice breaking. He looked up, and when he saw her, he took a step back, his expression a mixture of shock and fear. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough and defensive. Sophie took a tentative step toward him, her hands outstretched. "I came back for you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry I left you. We can stop him, Noah. We can make him pay for what he did to us, but I need you to be brave. I need you to tell the truth." He shook his head violently, his eyes wide with panic. "Are you crazy? He'll kill me," he said he would. He turned to run, but I stepped forward, blocking his path. I kept my voice calm and steady. "Noah," I said, "I'm a lawyer. My name is Liam. I can protect you. We have a safe place for you to go. We have evidence. We have other witnesses. You won't be alone in this. Your sister needs you, and you deserve a life free from him." He stared at me, then at Sophie, his internal battle raging across his face. We spent over an hour there by that school fence, Sophie patiently reminding him of the good moments they'd shared as children, and me explaining the legal protections we could put in place. Finally, his defensive wall began to crumble, with a shuddering sigh. He agreed to come with us, but he had to get some things from the house first. It was a risk, but we agreed, planning to wait for him down the street. Our plan went sideways when 20 minutes later my phone rang. It was Noah, his voice a panicked whisper. "He's home early, he's drunk, he found my bag, you have to come now." We raced to the house, my heart pounding against my ribs. The front door was ajar. As we stepped inside, the scene that greeted us was sickening. Richard Vance, a large, brutish man reeking of whiskey, was standing over Noah, who was curled on the floor, his face already swelling with bruises. "You little snake," Richard roared. "Trying to run off with your lying sister." Sophie screamed and rushed to her brother, shielding him with her own body. "Leave him alone," she cried out. That's when Alina emerged from the kitchen, her face a cold, emotionless mask. She looked at the scene without a flicker of concern. My rage, which I had kept simmering under a professional veneer, finally boiled over. I stepped between Richard and the two siblings, planting myself firmly in his path. "Get out of my house, lawyer boy," he sneered. "This is family business." "You're done," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You will never touch them again. I have medical records, sworn statements, and another one of your victims on tape. This ends tonight." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, but it was Alina who spoke, her voice like ice. "How dare you," she said, directing her venom at Sophie, "coming back here telling these disgusting lies. You were always a problem child, always trying to ruin this family." The finality of her mother's betrayal hit Sophie like a physical blow. Any lingering, secret hope she might have had for her mother's redemption died in that moment. I got Sophie and a trembling Noah out of that house, ignoring the volley of threats and insults hurled at our backs. The confrontation was ugly and traumatic, but it was also necessary. It had solidified our resolve. There would be no more quiet suffering, there would only be a fight. The following week, I filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Richard Vance for a litany of charges, including assault and abuse, and against Alina Vance for criminal complicity and endangerment. The case became a local media sensation in Providence. The trial was a grueling ordeal. Richard and Alina hired an expensive, shark-like lawyer named Carver, whose strategy was to viciously attack Sophie's character. He painted her as a mentally unstable woman with a vendetta, her diary as fantastical fiction, and the medical records as proof of a clumsy childhood. I watched as the jury's faces filled with doubt, and I felt a cold dread creep into my heart. The turning point came when I called Noah to the stand. He was terrified, but as he walked past Sophie, she gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. He took the oath, his voice barely a whisper. But when I asked him to tell the court what he had witnessed as a child, his voice grew stronger. He described in harrowing detail the nights he heard his sister crying. He recounted the time he had accidentally walked in on Richard in her room. And he described the years of threats and beatings he had endured to ensure his silence. He looked directly at the jury, his youthful face etched with a pain far beyond his years. "I was scared for a long time," he said, his voice ringing with newfound courage. "But I'm not scared anymore." Richard erupted in the courtroom, shouting that the boy was lying, his violent temper on full display for the jury to see. Alina began to sob, not with remorse but with self-pity, claiming her children were ungrateful. Their masks had slipped. The jury saw them for exactly what they were. When I played the recording of Lisa Reynolds' testimony detailing a clear pattern of predatory behavior from Richard, the case was sealed. The verdict came after 3 long days. Richard Vance was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to a substantial prison term. Alina received a shorter sentence for her role as an enabler, but for Sophie and Noah, it was a life sentence of freedom. As the bailiffs led their parents away, I saw the siblings exchange a look, not of triumph, but of profound, exhausted relief. The war was finally over. The guilty verdict was not an end, but a beginning. The legal battle was won, but the personal one, the long, arduous process of healing, was just commencing. In the days after the trial, a strange quiet settled over our lives. The constant state of high alert, the legal strategizing, the emotional turmoil, it all dissipated, leaving behind a fragile, tentative peace. Sophie was like a soldier returning from a war, relieved to be home but unsure how to live in a world without conflict. The shadows of her past hadn't vanished, but for the first time they weren't chasing her. "I feel lighter," she told me one evening as we sat on our balcony overlooking the city. "But I'm also still scared. I'm scared the memories will always be there." I took her hand. "They might be," I said honestly, "but they don't have to define you, and you never have to face them alone again." I gently suggested therapy. I wasn't trying to fix her, but I knew that the wounds she carried were too deep for love alone to heal. She was hesitant at first, afraid of the vulnerability, but she eventually agreed. "For us," she said, "and for me." Her sessions with a kind, patient therapist were challenging. Some days she would come home emotionally drained, her eyes red from crying. "It's like tearing open a wound to clean it," she explained, her head resting on my chest. "It hurts, but I think it's working." Slowly but surely I saw a change in her. The nightly ritual of checking the locks became less obsessive. The nightmares grew less frequent. She started to paint again, filling our apartment with vibrant canvases that felt like expressions of her reclaimed spirit. She was learning to forgive the young, helpless girl she had been and to embrace the powerful survivor she had become. Noah's healing was a different journey. He moved in with us, arriving with a single suitcase and the wide, cautious eyes of someone stepping into a new world. The first few weeks were quiet. He spent most of his time in his room, overwhelmed by the simple freedom of not having to walk on eggshells. Sophie was wonderful with him. She didn't push him to talk. Instead, she gave him space, cooking his favorite meals, helping him with his college applications, and slowly re-establishing the bond that had been stolen from them. I watched as he gradually began to shed his fear. His quietness was replaced by the typical sarcastic humor of a teenager. The sound of his laughter echoing through our apartment became one of my favorite things in the world. He was no longer just a victim or a witness. He was a kid with a future, dreaming of studying engineering. Amidst this new, peaceful normal, we started planning our wedding again. Sophie was adamant about it being small and simple. "No big spectacle," she said, "just the people who truly love us." I agreed completely. Our marriage wasn't about performance, it was a quiet affirmation of our commitment, a celebration of the family we had chosen to build. We picked a small, historic chapel in Brooklyn, its warm wooden interior and stained glass windows creating a sense of serene intimacy. The guest list was short: a few close friends, my parents, and Noah, who would be my best man. On the day of our wedding, I stood at the altar, my heart full. When the chapel doors opened, I saw Sophie. She wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, her brown hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wasn't escorted by anyone. She walked down the aisle alone, her gaze fixed on me, her smile radiant and genuine. It was a smile completely free of shadows, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. In that moment, she was not a survivor or a victim. She was just Sophie, my beautiful, resilient bride. We exchanged vows we had written ourselves. I promised to be her partner, her advocate, and her safe harbor for all of our days. She promised to trust me with her whole heart and to build a home with me founded on love, not fear. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the small chapel erupted in applause. Noah, standing beside me in a slightly too large suit, clapped the loudest, a huge grin on his face. Our life together wasn't a fairy tale ending where all the scars magically disappear. It was something far more real and more beautiful. It was a testament to the fact that healing is a process, that family is not defined by blood but by choice, and that love in its truest form is about walking into the darkness with someone and holding their hand until you find the light together. A few months after the wedding, the three of us were in the living room, arguing playfully over a movie. Noah was passionately defending a sci-fi flick while Sophie was making a case for a classic comedy. I sat back and just listened, a profound sense of peace washing over me. This was it. This was the life we had fought for. This was home. Later that night, Sophie and I stood on the balcony, her head on my shoulder. "We made it," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. She looked up at me, her eyes sparkling under the city lights. "We did," she said softly. "We're living, Liam," and she was right. Our story, born from pain and secrecy, had finally truly begun.